Hello and welcome to another motorcycling video. For context, I have finished my morning run on Tuesday the 18th of August and I'm just riding home, riding around town while I'm getting home. Sometimes governments have to make decisions that are in the interests of the population and in the interests of the nation, but are unpopular at the time they make them. And in some cases, may be the case that people say, well, we don't agree with that decision, we don't want to have to do that thing. But the government says, well, we see a greater good here and we're going to pass whatever legislation it is that's necessary to pass to do this thing that we think is in the greater good. You might argue, for example, that the legislation that the current Commonwealth government is passing through the Parliament to do with gambling ads is an example of that. They say there is incontrovertible evidence that gambling is causing harm in the community and that it needs to be regulated, and that the gambling industry is not able or unwilling to regulate itself properly, and so the government has passed legislation which will prohibit gambling companies from advertising at certain times of the day during certain types of programming, and particularly during live sport. Some people might argue that's a case of the nanny state, but the government will be saying, well, we see that there's a problem here. We see that we have to act in, and I'm not arguing in favour or against these laws, I'm just making a statement as how I understand what they're doing. They say, we see there's a problem here. We see that the gambling industry is unable or unwilling to regulate itself properly, so we have to do that for them. Now, that happens in all sorts of parts of our lives, but one example where it happens very frequently is when governments pass laws regarding traffic and driving and everything related to cars. A really clear example of that would be when seatbelts were designed and invented. And if my memory serves me correctly, the seatbelt was invented by the then Swedish car company Volvo. And when it was established that a seatbelt would be a life-saving device, not only would it save lives, it would prevent catastrophic injuries, especially to children, if they were properly restrained in the back of the car. Then instead of just sit in the back of the car, and when the car stopped and when there was an accident, the children were thrown about like rag dolls, or in some cases even would fly over the back seat and perhaps through the windscreen. When it was clear that a seatbelt was a life-saving device, governments mandated, in Australia certainly, governments mandated that seatbelts needed to be fitted to cars and they needed to be worn. The state of Victoria was either the first state in Australia, or it may have been the first state worldwide, to mandate the wearing of seatbelts. In Australia, it's a simple thing. You get in the car, you put the seatbelt on. There are no exemptions, there are no exceptions, there are no reasons that you can advance in court if you choose to go down that path to say why you didn't wear a seatbelt. The law is quite clear. I'm not offering legal advice, I'm just stating facts here. In New South Wales, certainly, they have seatbelt detection cameras. So there's a camera that detects if you are not wearing your seatbelt or if you are not wearing it correctly, and it will automatically issue you with a fine. The definition of wearing a seatbelt is stated correctly in the legislation. It has to be across your shoulder and clicked in and all that sort of stuff. But the legislation is clear, and the governments of the time said, well, we see how this thing is a life-saving device. We're going to mandate that people have them in their cars, and we're going to mandate that people wear them. And there may have been people at the time who said, well, I don't want the government to tell me what to do. I can decide for myself if I want to wear a seatbelt or not. And the government is saying, well, we're not interested in letting you do that. We're going to make a standard law across the country. All the transport ministers got together and said, seatbelts are compulsory, everybody wear one, end of story. Now, a similar case can be made for the wearing of helmets by motorcyclists. I think when I first started riding a motorcycle, which must have been about 1970, I was still in high school, and I'd inherited a Russian-made motorcycle called a Voshkod from my older brother who had gone to university and was using public transport to get to university. and I inherited the motorcycle, and I used to ride it to school. And I don't recall at the time having to wear a helmet, but by the time I owned my first motorcycle, which was about 1971, maybe 72, possibly 1972, that first motorcycle was a Honda CB250, an orange one if I recall. I was wearing a helmet. Now, it may have been that by that time the law had changed, and my father had said, well, if you're going to have this motorcycle of your own and you're going to ride it to from where we live in Sydney to where you're going to go to Teachers College in Armidale, then you're going to wear a helmet. Certainly by the time I had that motorcycle, which is in 1972, I was wearing a helmet. And I assumed the reason I was wearing a helmet was because it had become the law. Now, again, the evidence is incontrovertible. There is no argument about helmets saving lives. In states where, in the United States, for example, where helmets are not mandatory, in states where people wear helmets, the number of deaths caused where a person wears a helmet is about 10% of all deaths. In states where helmets are not compulsory, or only compulsory for certain ages and people, and I'll get to that in a minute, the death toll is much higher, up to around 45 or 50% of all accidents involving motorcyclists involve the death of a person who is not wearing a helmet. So in Australia, at some point the transport ministers of all the states got together and decided, hey, helmets are a good idea. They save lives. They will prevent catastrophic and traumatic brain injuries and facial injuries. If it's a brain injury, it's unlikely that you're going to recover from it. And so they're a good idea, and we're going to insist that everybody who rides a motorcycle, no matter what the size of the motorcycle is, whether it's a postie 110cc bike or a 108 cubic inch Harley Davidson, whether you are a learner rider of 16 and 9 months or you are an experienced rider of 30 or 40 or 50 years of age, you wear a helmet. No matter whether you are the rider or the pillion, you wear a helmet. There are no exceptions. There are no reasons that you would be able to advance to avoid a fine for not wearing a helmet. The law is clear. Again, I'm not issuing legal advice, I'm just stating facts. The only requirement is that the helmet must meet Australian standards. And so when you go to buy your helmet, you'll find a sticker on the back that says Australian standards and the standard that it meets and so forth. I believe that, I don't want to be quoted about this because it may be incorrect, that you can also have ones that meet the European standard, but I'm not 100% certain about that, so don't quote me. When you go to buy your helmet, it'll have a sticker on the back saying it meets Australian standards and the standard that it meets, and you are required to wear that. You can often see at motorcycle shows and so on, motorcyclists wearing those helmets that look like German World War I think it was, helmets with the spike on the top of the helmet. They are not legal to be worn on the road because they do not meet Australian standards. You can wear them at a show like that when you're not on the road for public display or entertainment or whatever the hell it is you want to wear it for, but you cannot wear it on the road because it does not meet the Australian standard. So helmets in Australia, mandatory for everybody. Now I'm talking about all this because in the United States, helmet laws vary greatly. There are three states that have no helmet laws. So you can decide for yourself whether you want to wear a helmet or you don't. If you don't wear a helmet, there is no penalty. If you wear a helmet, that's fine. You don't get any pat on the back. You just do or don't decide to wear a helmet. Some states have mandatory helmet laws for everybody, no matter what age or what sort of motorcycle you ride. 2 wheels, 3 wheels, 2 wheels on the front, 2 wheels on the back, sidecar, no sidecar, whatever. The law in some states is everybody on the motorcycle, no matter what their age, no matter what their riding experience or whatever, wears a helmet. In some other states it varies according to ages. For example, in some states, if you are under 17, you must wear a helmet. In other states it's under 18, under 21 in some states, and in some other states it's under 25, and you can avoid wearing a helmet if you're under 25. I made a video about this, I think to do with the state of Michigan some time ago. If you have insurance, and you have proof of that insurance. So I presume that at the point of where you have an accident and you're lying on the road and the first responders are working out what to do with your remains and your motorcycle, they check your pockets and see, well, did you have insurance to not wear the helmet? Oh, well, that's okay then. Anyway, I'm sure that the legislators in each of the states that have these laws that vary by age have a good explanation for why they have them. I can't, for the life of me, explain why a 16 or 17-year-old person's brain is any more or less valuable than a 25-year-old's or a 50-year-old's or whatever. So if you have to wear a helmet and you're under 18, presumably when you reach the age of 18 in that state, you no longer have to wear a helmet. Now that's a bit of a confusion because you can go from one state that has a mandatory helmet law, and I know, for example, that California has a mandatory helmet law. Now if you were riding east, and I don't pretend to know all the states that are east of California and their appropriate regulations, but if you were riding east and rode into another state that didn't have a helmet law, then presumably you can take your helmet off and tie it to your motorcycle somewhere with no problem. If you forgot to put it back on when you got into California and you were pulled over by the highway patrol or whatever authority it is there, I assume you would be issued with a fine and you would attract some demerit points. Now I'm talking about all this because Washington DC is a unique entity in the United States. For those who don't know, Washington DC, the city of Washington is the capital of the United States. DC stands for the District of Columbia, and it is an area of land defined around the capital city of Washington that belongs to the federal government. In the same way as before self-government in the ACT, the capital city of Australia was Canberra, and there was territory around it called the Australian Capital Territory, which until the Australian Capital Territory was given self-government, was controlled by the federal government. Now in the United States, in Washington DC, Washington DC does not have self-government. It has a sort of semi-autonomous form of government by form of a council, which is made up of a mayor who is elected, of course, and an attorney general who is elected, and then a number of aldermen or councillors or whatever they're called, whatever the correct term for them is, who administer the city of Washington. Over and above anything that the council of the city of Washington might decide, it is subject to and can be overridden by federal law. Now, Washington DC and the council that governs it or manages it has a mandatory helmet law. In other words, if you live in the Washington DC area and you ride a motorcycle, you must wear a helmet. There are no ifs or buts as far as I can determine. Washington DC does not have its own representatives with voting rights in the Congress. They have people in the Congress who are observers, but they are not able to vote. So the federal government can override any legislation passed by the Washington DC Council on the basis that federal law takes precedence over any local law. Two members of the Congress, one a Republican from Montana, and the other a Republican from, I think, is Wisconsin, are attempting to have introduced a bill to the Congress, that is to the legislative branch of the American government, to overturn the mandatory helmet law in Washington DC. They want it repealed. They have called their bill the Freedom to Ride Act, and by that they're implying that a person should be free to ride their motorcycle however they want, regardless of what the statistics might tell lawmakers about the safety of helmets, regardless of what the statistics and health professionals who deal in these sorts of things might tell the lawmakers or might testify at any committee hearings about the safety of helmets and how they save lives, how they protect people from traumatic brain injury and traumatic facial injuries that may require hours and hours and thousands of dollars of cosmetic surgery and still may not restore the person's face to what it was before. These two people, both men and both motorcyclists, say that they want the bill repealed. The Motorcycle Riders Foundation is supporting that idea on the basis that Washington DC being the capital of the United States, it should embody that idea of freedom and choice and people making up their own mind about whether they do or do not want to wear a helmet. And if they don't want to wear a helmet, there should be no penalty attached to it. And so they are supporting the legislation. Now, just the fact that the legislation is introduced does not mean that it's going to be passed. It has been sent to a committee, I think a transport committee, and they will examine the legislation, perhaps hold hearings, perhaps call various witnesses, experts in trauma care, experts in emergency room medicine, experts in road safety and so on, motorcyclists, members of motorcycle clubs and groups, and all sorts of people may well be invited to give testimony. On the other hand, some of those people may not be invited to give testimony. There's no predicting how these committees will do things, and at the end of that time the committee may well publish a report saying what it is they think should happen in regard to the legislation. They may recommend that the legislation move forward to be voted upon, or perhaps they could recommend that the legislation not proceed because the overwhelming evidence is that wearing a helmet is a safety feature and a life-saving feature, and there is no reason to change the existing arrangement. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the two people who have proposed this piece of legislation say, well, yes, it is about giving riders the freedom of choice to decide for themselves what they want to do in the Washington DC area, but there is a greater thing at play here. They are attempting to use this piece of legislation as a stalking horse to be able to challenge other states where mandatory helmet laws apply and have them overturned on the basis that federal law supersedes or overrides state law, and that people should be free to make their own choices about matters such as wearing a helmet. Okay, none of this applies to us because we don't live in the United States, and I could not envisage any sensible or serious legislator in any Australian Parliament wanting to introduce such a law. In Australia, most matters, in fact all matters relating to motor vehicles, that is the registration of motor vehicles, the licensing of the drivers or riders of those motor vehicles, the speed limits on the roads, the drink driving laws, the drug driving laws, and various matters like that are the responsibilities of the state government. The Commonwealth Government has no jurisdiction and no responsibility in regard to things like that. It is the state government that decides whether to put a mobile speed camera in your street, whether to put a speed camera on the traffic lights, whether to put a red light camera on the traffic lights, whether to put a give way sign at an intersection or not. It is the state government that decides what shall be the fine for somebody speeding and how many demerit points will be attached to the offence. It is the state government that sets the limit for how much alcohol you can have in your system without being fined. It is the state government that decides which substances you're allowed to have ingested and still drive your vehicle. And although there may be tweaks and differences between various states, for most parts, as far as possible, the laws are generally uniform. The national speed limit is 110 kilometres an hour. The speed limit in a built-up area, a residential area, is 50 kilometres an hour. In a non-residential area that is not a freeway or motorway or major highway, the speed limit can be 100 kilometres an hour or can be 80 kilometres an hour. And those sort of things are nationwide, because the transport ministers of all the states have said, well, we have to have uniformity about those. We don't want people crossing the border between New South Wales and Victoria and not knowing what the speed limit is, or between Queensland and New South Wales and not knowing what the speed limit is. So there's a standard, those sort of things are standard. There are variations in licensing requirements between the states, but the graded system of licences, that is a learner's permit, a red provisional licence, a green provisional licence and a full licence, those conditions are the same in all the states. The number of hours that you have to do in order to, when you're on your learner's permit in order to get a licence, might vary from 100 to 120 in some states, but the variation is minimal. So all of those things are the matters that are decided by the state government. I could not envisage a situation where any serious state politician of any party would come to the Parliament and introduce a bill that said, let's, for example, take seatbelts out of cars or take airbags out of cars. They cost the manufacturers money, and if we take them out, the price of cars will go down. I could not imagine anybody saying that, simply because we know that seatbelts save lives. We know that airbags save lives. And yes, they are an expense, but when you consider how many cars are made by any given manufacturer at the same time, at any given time, the cost per airbag is probably negligible because they're buying so many of them. And the cost per seatbelt is probably negligible because they're buying so many of them and putting them in cars. I could not imagine that any legislator would come to the Parliament and say, let's change the laws on how children are restrained in cars so that they don't have to be restrained, and your baby in a capsule does not have to be restrained in the capsule. It's okay for them to sit in their mother's lap while they're driving, because that sort of thing used to be okay. We could do those things. Mothers could hold the babies in their lap. Children sat in the back of the car and were not restrained. But we were sensible and said, no, we're going to have seatbelt laws and they're going to apply to everybody. So I couldn't imagine a situation where anybody that was a sensible legislator would come to a Parliament in Australia and say, we're going to repeal the helmet law. It's an inconvenience. When a person buys a helmet, buys a motorcycle, they've already got to buy the motorcycle, they've got to pay the registration, insurance, and then if they buy boots and gloves and a jacket and pants, that's a lot of money, and buying a helmet's another expense, and they shouldn't have to do it. So we're going to I just couldn't see that happening, because we know that helmets save lives. We know that they protect against catastrophic brain injuries and traumatic facial injuries. So I can't see a situation like that happening in Australia. I can imagine, I don't have any research to substantiate what I'm about to say, but I imagine that the vast majority of motorcyclists, even the ones who grudgingly do it, put a helmet on because they know it's a safe thing to do, or the ones that are violently or virulently against wearing a helmet, they put it on because they don't want to pay the fine, they don't want to have the demerit points on their licence, and they don't want to face the possibility that if they collect too many demerit points in a 12-month period, they'll lose their licence and they won't be able to ride at all. So they might grudgingly say, well, I don't really want to wear a helmet, but I want to put it on because I don't want to pay the fines, and so on and so forth. The ladies who are, and it's ladies mostly, but I suppose it's some blokes as well sometimes, who are worried about helmet hair or whatever, for goodness sake, carry a comb or a brush or whatever and give your hair a bit of a touch-up with the comb or the brush when you get to where you're going. Helmet hair is the least of your worries. If you fall off the bike, your head is the heaviest part of your body, and gravity means that the heaviest part of your body is going to hit the road first, and it's going to hit the road hard. If it's not contained inside a helmet, then it's going to hit concrete or black top like I'm riding on at the moment, and the impact is going to be pretty serious, and in some cases you're going to suffer a traumatic brain injury that cannot be reversed. You will not recover from. In some cases you might just suffer facial injuries, but those facial injuries may take months and months and hours and costly surgeries to correct. and you might end up enjoying your food through a straw for a very long time. While we're talking about protective gear then, I know I've been going on now about helmets for something like 25 minutes or so, but while we're talking about protective gear, think about the other items of protective gear that you should include in your wardrobe. You wear the helmet for the reasons that I've laid out. The next thing that happens when you have a fall on your motorcycle is you put your hands down to break the fall. So you need to wear gloves. You need to wear good, strong leather gloves, and you need to wear ones that have got knuckle protection in them, because, as I said, when you put your hands, you're going to put your hands down to break the fall, and you're going to end up with fingers or knuckles broken. You should wear strong, laced-up shoes, no open-toed shoes, no joggers, no soft shoes like that, because sometimes when motorcyclists are found after the accident, they've lost their shoes because they've worn those lighter pairs of shoes that have just been pulled off or fallen off or something or other. The steel-capped boots and the high boots that come up around your calves above your ankles are going to protect your ankles and your toes and that sort of thing, but they're also going to protect your calves from road burn and gravel rash and that sort of stuff, and they may even be instrumental in protecting you from a broken bone in your lower leg. You need to wear a jacket, first of all, to keep the wind out, but also because when you go down on the road, no matter what it is you're wearing, there's going to be some sort of interaction between your body and the clothing you're wearing and the road surface. And if you're riding on a blacktop like this, then that surface is pretty abrasive. And if you're not wearing a jacket that includes armour at the elbows and shoulders, but if you're not wearing a good strong jacket, then all you've got between yourself is a t-shirt or a sloppy joe or whatever, and pretty soon it's going to be your skin that is being abraded away. Skin grafts are possible to repair that skin that you've lost, but in order to do that they have to cut skin off you somewhere else and put it to where you've lost skin and hope that it's going to take, and that's not always successful. And I'm not offering medical advice, I'm just again stating information that I think is well known. Skin grafts aren't always successful, and they can be quite painful. So you need to wear a jacket, you need to wear a good quality jacket, and you also need to wear good quality pants. Now, good quality pants can vary from the Kevlar infused denim jeans with the armour in the knees and the hips, to full leathers, to some other sort of dry rider type gear that has several layers between it and your skin and has armour in the hips and the knees. So, what's the takeaway from all this? Well, I guess there isn't really a takeaway in the sense that I have not heard of, and I would not expect to ever hear anyone in Australia say, well, we're going to repeal the helmet law. I can't imagine that happening, but I am arguing and saying to you, you should wear a helmet, and you should wear it all the time. It should be an Australian standards one, and if your helmet has fallen off your bike and hit the concrete, hit the road, it's probably not much chop and you need to think about replacing it. That other gear that I talked about, you probably should consider investing in that. And if you can't afford the gear and you're buying a bike, you probably shouldn't buy the bike, because the gear is going to ultimately prevent injury and save your life. Well, thanks for watching and thanks for listening. If you're watching in the United States and you can explain to me more detail about this legislation, I'd love to hear it in the comments. If you have an opinion or a comment you'd like to make, leave it in the usual place. When I become aware of it, I will respond. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If I've made a mistake, please feel free to correct me, and I will catch you when I'm making the next video. Not exactly sure when that'll be, but whenever it is, I'll certainly catch you. There's about 30 seconds to go, so please watch to the end. Not because there's anything interesting, but please just watch to the end of the video. Thanks for watching.